Time for us to begin this morning. We're going to continue Jerry's study in Isaiah with the last of lesson 16, which will be chapter 57 in Isaiah. But before we get into that, just one administrative thing that I need to take care of. I was informed the other day that on Wednesday night I promoted Esther to king of Persia, and I don't think as patient and as receiving as the king was that he would appreciate that. So she was just the queen of Persia. But it's like I told somebody one time, sometimes my tongue gets wrapped around my eye tooth and I can't see what I'm saying, so you'll have to forgive me for that. All right, Isaiah chapter 57. In chapter 57, Isaiah kind of regresses back to his discussion of idolatry and the futility of idolatry. But before he gets into the study of idolatry, the first two verses of chapter 57 deal more with the righteous and what the status of the righteous is, what will happen to them. Notice as he begins, he says, "The righteous perish, and no man takes it to heart. Merciful men are taken away while no one considers. The righteous is taken away from evil. He may enter into peace. They shall rest in their beds, each one walking in his uprightness." So Isaiah says there's two things about the righteous that a lot of people don't understand, a lot of people don't appreciate. One is that he's taken away from evil. Just think about the world you live in, and the condition of the world in general is unrighteousness. And Isaiah is saying the righteous man is taken out of that at death. Just think about what the residing place of the righteous will be like. There will be no sin there. There will be no death or sickness or anything like that. And so the righteous man is taken from evil. But the second thing that he points out is that death is not the end of him. He shall enter into peace. They shall rest in their beds, each one walking in his uprightness. So he not only is taken out of evil, but he enters into peace. He goes into a place of peace and comfort where there is no unrighteousness. And so Isaiah is just saying, it's kind of a contrast that he makes in the first two verses relative to what he's going to say in the rest of the chapter, beginning in verse 3, about those who focus upon their idolatry. And so in verses 3 through 14, he makes a contrast to these righteous people in verses 1 and 2. And his point is the righteous man doesn't have anything to fear, but the idolater who worships an inanimate object needs to be fearful. He needs to understand that he is not going to be taken away from evil. He is not going to find peace when this life is over. So in verses 3 through 5, then he talks about the idolater. And when you think about idolatry, on many occasions it was more than just the worship of an inanimate object. In many cases there was occult practices, there was sometimes drugs used, there were spells. And so there were a lot of things that went along with the practice of idolatry, and we see that Isaiah talks about in verse 3 through 5. Notice he says, "But come here, you sons of the sorcerer." I want you to recognize the different types of people that he identifies here. He says, "You offspring of the adulterer and the harlot." And so he says, first of all, he recognizes that some are adulterers and some are harlots. Whom do you ridicule? Against whom do you make a wide mouth and stick out the tongue? Are you not children of transgression, offspring of falsehood? There are some that are just liars. And he says that's who you are. That's the class of people that you are associating with. Verse 5, "Inflaming yourself with gods under green trees, slaying the children in the valley under the cleft of the rock." He identifies something here that was not only just idolatry, but he says this is one of the most heinous things you can think about: the sacrificing of children. The Jews ever do that? Yes, they did. As part of their worship in idolatry, they would sacrifice their children in some instances. And so he's saying, just think about the people that he identifies in these verses: adulterers, harlots, liars, and people that sacrifice their children. That's the kind of people that are dealing with this idolatry. And then beginning in verse 6, he says, "Among the smooth stones of the stream is your portion. They are your lot. Even to them you have poured a drink offering. You have offered a grain offering. Should I receive comfort in these?" It seems that there was a circumstance where some people would go down and they would gather these smooth river rocks and they would fashion for themselves within their home kind of their own personal idol. And he's going to talk about that more in the following verses. But they would develop their own idols. And they would offer drink offerings to these idols. They would offer grain offerings to these idols. And God says, should I receive comfort in this? In other words, God is saying, what are you doing for me? You're not doing anything for me. You're doing it for this personal item that you have constructed for yourself. And then look at verses 7 through 10. What were the Israelites commanded to do relative to God's word? How were they commanded to remember God's word? Where were they to write it? On their doorpost and on their gates. And if you go back into Deuteronomy and read what God instructs them to do, he said, you'll wear it as frontlets between your eyes. Sometimes you have seen these little boxes kind of things that they would have on their forehead. And supposedly that was to carry the law of God so that it was always before them. And God was trying to impress upon them the need to continually read and to be aware of His Word, to teach it to their children, to pass it on. And so that's what he's talking about. And apparently these idolaters had kind of developed this kind of activity. Notice beginning in verse 7. On a lofty and high mountain you have set your beds. Even there you went up to offer sacrifices. You can go back to Ezekiel, the 16th chapter, and in verse 16, Ezekiel talks about these high places that they have set up to offer their sacrifices. And one of the instructions that that was given by God to some of the kings that came in was to tear down these high places, to get rid of these places of worship. Now look at verse 8. Also behind the doors and their posts you have set up your remembrances. And so they took this idea that God had instructed the Jews about writing the law on their doorpost and upon their gates. And Isaiah is saying, you've adopted this concept. You set up your own little remembrances in your house, but these kind of remembrances weren't the kind that was pleasing to God. They were remembrances to their own personal gods that they had developed, and in some cases to God of fertility and that sort of thing. For you have uncovered yourself to those other than me, to gods other than God, and have gone up to them and have enlarged your bed and made a covenant with them. You have loved their bed where you saw their nudity. If you have a footnote in your Bible, it may say that's kind of a euphemism for hand. And if you go back and look at Lamentations 2:14, for example, says the idea there is that these false prophets that they had prophesied, they had seen things in vain. They had prophesied about a lot of things, but they had not discovered the iniquity. They did not recognize the iniquity that all of these people were practicing in their idol worship. And so he said, you have loved your beds where you saw their nudity. You went to the king with ointment and increased your perfume. You sent your messengers far off and even descended to Sheol. You are wearied in the length of your ways. You did not say there is no hope. You have found the life of your hand. Therefore you were not grieved. And so he's just saying, they've done all these things. They've set up these idols. They have worshiped them, and they've offered to them grain offerings and drink offerings. And they've gone all over the place, sending out messengers about their idols. But they've received nothing beneficial from that. He says they don't even recognize that there's no hope. They don't recognize that it's not providing any hope for them. You are wearied in the length of your ways. You did not say there is no hope. And then he says you weren't grieved. But look at verse 8. And of whom have you been afraid or feared, that you have lied and not remembered me, nor taken it to your heart? Is it not because I have held my peace from old that you do not fear me? And so God is saying, you didn't pay attention to me. And why is that? He says, don't you fear me? Don't you fear God? And notice there's one thing here in verse 8. He says, is it not because I have held my peace from old that you do not fear me? God is saying, here may be a reason you don't fear me, is that you think about the Jews and their idolatry. You think about God's patience with them, God's forgiveness of them, as they would turn back to Him when things got so bad that they needed more help than their idols would give them. And so they would turn to God, and He would forgive them. And I think what Isaiah is putting forth here in verse 8, or in verse 11, is that these people don't fear God because God has not brought judgment upon them at this point in time. But then notice verse 12, I will declare your righteousness and your works, and they will not profit you. And so there's coming a time when God is going to deal with this. Look at verse 13. It says, when you cry out, let your collection of idols deliver you, but the wind will carry them away. And so he's just saying, you have all these problems that you cry to me for, and you have these idols, let them take care of that. Let them do that. See how well they provide for you. He says the wind is just going to carry them away. A breath will take them. But now here's the contrast. But he who puts his trust in me shall possess the land and shall inherit my holy mountain. And so that's the contrast Isaiah and God are beginning to make with these idolaters, is you depend upon these inanimate things that you construct from smooth river stones or trees or whatever it might be. You make offerings to them, you depend upon them, you pray to them, you proselyte people to your worship of these idols. And he says, they really don't profit you anything. They don't do anything to provide for you. But he who puts his trust in me, in God, shall possess the land. In other words, you can be blessed by God by putting your trust in him. So in these verses 15 through 21, he's talking about the righteous. Verse 14, one shall say, heap it up, prepare the way, take the stumbling block out of the way of my people. There's coming a time when they will come to God and they will desire that this stumbling block, this idolatry be taken out of the way. For thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits the eternity. I want you to pay attention here as he goes through these verses and describes who God is. The high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place. That's who God is. And when you think about God, and you think about God coming down to associate, to be with people here upon this earth, it's kind of hard to comprehend him doing that, but that's what he says. I dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and humble spirit. In Micah, the 6th chapter and verse 8, see if we can. Micah 6 and verse 8 says, He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's who Isaiah is identifying here when he says, I will dwell with him who has a contrite and humble spirit. And so that's what it's going to take to be pleasing to God. That's what it took then. That's what it's going to take now, is someone who has a contrite and humble spirit. To revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite one. In other words, these people that are currently practicing all this idolatry, they need to turn from that, and they need to develop this kind of spirit, this kind of heart. Nor will I always be angry, for the spirit would fail before me, and the soul of which I have made for the iniquity of his covetousness. I was angry and struck him. I hid and was angry, and he went on backsliding in the way of his heart. I have seen his ways and will heal him. I will also lead him and restore comfort to him and to his mourners. That's what God is promising to those who turn from their idolatry and start bowing down to him, who have a humble and a contrite heart toward him, who follow his law. You think about Israel. And I think we're going to see that some in chapter 58, is that they always made a pretext of worshiping God. They fasted, they offered sacrifices, they did all of these kind of things. And yet they would just do that, and then they would turn around and they would start worshiping idols. They would start worshiping other gods and be disobedient toward God's law. You think about when they came to Sinai. Moses had told them some of the things God required of them, and they said, yes, we will do that. We hear God's word, we will keep his word, we will do those things. And then they turned right around, and what did they do? Started worshiping a golden calf, didn't they? And so that's part of the things Isaiah is saying here in this chapter, and he's going to talk more specifically in the next chapter about their fasting and what they thought of fasting. And they did these things kind of as a matter of just thinking it was pleasing to God if they did them, if they fasted, if they offered sacrifice. They even stopped keeping the Sabbath at some time. And so what God is saying here is you need to turn from that. You need to have a humble and a contrite heart, and you do that. And he says, I have seen his ways and will heal him. I will also lead him. God is saying, I will provide you with forgiveness. I will forgive. I will heal your iniquities and lead you then in the righteous paths. So in verse 19, I create the fruit of the lips, peace, peace to him who is far off and to him who is near. I think this gets a little more God looking forward here, to him who is far off. When he says peace, peace here, he's talking, it's kind of an emphatic type of statement where he is emphasizing this is the highest form of peace that God is offering. It's not a peace that we can get from worshiping idols. It is a peace that we get from worshiping God. Kind of like Paul says in Thessalonians or in Philippians when he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication and thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes understanding, will guard your heart and mind through Jesus Christ. And so that's the kind of peace that he's talking about here. It's one that man cannot provide. It's one his idols cannot provide. But it's a peace that comes from our service to God. And then he says that peace will be offered not just to the Jews, to him who is far off. Who is that? Gentiles? I think he's talking about Jew and Gentile here. To him who is far off, to him who is near. And he says, I will heal him, both Jew and Gentile. We know that is coming through the Messiah. But the wicked are like the troubled sea, when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. So he's making this contrast throughout this chapter of the righteous and what God will do for the righteous, and the unrighteous and what their ultimate situation will be. God says, I've held off at times. And because I have held off, I've not apparently been aware of these things. People think, well, God is not paying any attention. Kind of like Habakkuk. When Habakkuk looked at all that was going on around him, and he says, God, do you really know what's going on? Do you really care? And I think sometimes we get that attitude. We kind of get that feeling as well. We look around at the world today and we say, reckon God really understands what we're going through down here? Yes, he does. But he says, in contrast to what God has promised to do to give rest to the righteous, look at verse 21. He says, there is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. That's their consequence. That's their ultimate place. There won't be any rest. It'll just be torment that they will be brought upon them. And so he has begun here with the righteous, talking about what they will be taken from evil. You know, sometimes I think we get to feeling like death is something to be dreaded. You look forward to dying. Older I get, the less, the more I think about that. But when I was young, I would think, I don't want to die. But what he's saying here is for the righteous, for the one that has humbled himself before God, for one who has a contrite heart, death is something to anticipate. It's like Paul said, for me to die is gain. That's something that was beneficial for Paul. He recognized that others could benefit from his living, but for him personally, death was something to look forward to. And that's exactly what Isaiah is putting forth here. You know, back in, trying to think where it is, in Psalm, it says there, blessed are those who die in the Lord. And he says, precious in the sight of God are the death of his saints. In Joshua, the first chapter, you know, Moses has just died. And in that first chapter of Joshua, it says, my servant Moses is dead. I think that's something to contemplate, to think about. I have a sermon that I've done, I think I've done it here a long time ago, back in 20 or whenever COVID was going on the Jordan River. And at first we think, what is significant about the Jordan River? There's nothing really significant about the Jordan River. It's not the longest river. But it's one that most people recognize. Why? Because that's what the Bible talks about. That's where Jesus was baptized. That's where John was preaching and baptizing. But then you think about the Jordan when the Israelites, and this is just a little aside here. You think about the Jordan when the Israelites came to enter into the promised land the second time. They were down just across from Jericho, which is down toward the Dead Sea. And you think about the Jordan River, the Dead Sea is some 600 feet or more below sea level. And so the Jordan River starts in the mountains and it flows down to below sea level. Gets very violent in the flood season. I grew up around rivers like that in the spring when the rains would come and all the land would feed water into them and they would be violent. And so when the Israelites came to the Jordan River, it could have been 1/4 of a mile wide in this valley. Steep banks on both sides that they had to go down, then they had to climb up. Can you imagine what the priests must have thought when Joshua said, take the Ark of the Covenant and step in the water? That took some courage, I would think, to do that. But when they did, what happened? Waters parted. And they walked across on dry land. I think the picture here is when we die as a Christian. Death is not something to be dreaded. But instead of this dark, dreary journey that we think we're going to have to take, we come to the waters of the Jordan. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye. And we step into that water and we're on the other side. We're on the side of peace and safety and calm. And that's what Isaiah is saying about the righteous man here. That he will provide that in contrast to those who are wicked, unrighteous. Any comments on chapter 57 before we move on? All right. Lesson 17 then begins chapter 58. And he's going to talk in these verses about fasting and what the Israelites, how they looked at fasting. If you look at chapter 58, Isaiah is going to kind of cry out against the God's people, against Israel. In fact, there are those that take the position, may be true, I don't know, that Isaiah, these are kind of spoken prophecies that Isaiah gives, because you notice as chapter 58 begins, says, cry aloud, speak, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet. And so it's obvious that Isaiah is being instructed to communicate these words to the people vocally. And so he's going to talk about God's people here, Israel. And then in chapter 59, he's going to just generally encourage people to turn to God. And in chapter 60, he's going to talk about the glory of God and how it is going to shine on God's people, what it will do for God's people. And he talks a lot in chapter 60 about light. And we can kind of think of what John writes in Revelation, beginning about chapter 20, 21 and through there, about light in that eternal home. I don't know that John, that what Isaiah is talking about there is relative to that eternal home, or whether he's talking about what the church that Christ comes to establish, talking about that. But it could be either one. And like Jerry says in his notes, since it's all figurative language to begin with, reserves the right to change his mind. So do I. But Isaiah in chapter 58 begins by saying, cry out, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet, tell the people their transgressions. So it's obvious that what Isaiah is being instructed to do here is communicate to these people what their problem is, because they obviously don't recognize it sometimes. tell the people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins. So he's speaking specifically here to the Israelites. Now, look at beginning in verse 2. He says, yet they seek me daily and delight to know my way as a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching God. They seem to be enamored, if you will, with pretending to follow God. They want to know His will. Yes, we will do that. And then they turn around and they disobey. Look at verse 3. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? They have. Why have we afflicted our soul and you take no notice? In fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all your labors. They fasted a lot. Had God required that? How many fasts did God require of them? One. Remember when it was? The Day of Atonement. They were to fast and to afflict their soul. And we think of fasting as refraining from eating of food. And that was certainly involved. In fact, a lot of the times when we read about fasting in the New Testament, it was about going without food for a period of time. But what was fasting really about? Fasting was more about putting off material things, focusing on spiritual things. Now, specifically, it was about setting aside your desire for food that you might focus upon the food that was spiritual, the things that would nourish your spiritual body as opposed to your physical body. And so the Jews put a lot of emphasis on fasting. They fasted a lot for two reasons. First of all, they thought it pleased God. It really didn't. Secondly, they thought that it made the one that was fasting look pious. As you read through the New Testament, we find those who were fasting. And they made themselves look like, oh, he's so pious because he's going without food. He's just, and Jesus says what you ought to do is clean yourself up and just go on and not broadcast it. Don't make it public that you're fasting. But here, they put a lot of emphasis on fasting because they thought it pleased God. And they did all these other things to seek Him, but then they would turn right around and they would disobey Him. They would violate His law. And so here's their question in verse 3. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? In other words, God, pay attention here. We're worshiping you. We're fasting to you. Why have we afflicted our soul and you take no notice? Had they really afflicted their soul? No, they hadn't. That's what the fast on the Day of Atonement was for, to afflict their soul. So they were taking language from what God had commanded of them, and they were applying it to what they had come up with on their own that they thought would be pleasing to God. In fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all your labors. Here's what they were doing. He says you fast because you're the one that takes pleasure in it. God doesn't. You're fasting to please yourself, not God. And on top of what you're doing when you fast, you exploit your labors. You fast for strife and debate and to strike with a fist of wickedness. You will not fast as you do this day to make your voice heard on high. And so they just did everything that was contrary to God's word. And I think our time is up. So we'll stop there. Jerry, pick up there and clean all that up.